Hey, it's time for chapter 15 of To Kill a Mockingbird. And things start to really heat up. Well, I'm going to just dive into it and we'll talk about it afterwards. And I am on page 193 in case you are reading along, but feel free to just plug in and listen as I go. After many telephone calls, much pleading on behalf of the defendant, and a long, forgiving letter from his mother, it was decided that Dill would stay. We had a week of peace altogether. After that, little it seemed. A nightmare was upon us. It began one evening after supper. Dill was over, Aunt Alexandra was in her chair in the corner, Atticus was in his. Jem and I were on the floor reading. It had been a placid week. I had minded Auntie. Jem had outgrown the treehouse, but helped Dill and me construct a new rope ladder for it. Dill had hit upon a foolproof plan to make Boo Radley come out at no cost to ourselves, place a trail of lemon drops from the back door to the front door, and he'd follow it like an ant. There was a knock on the front door. Jem answered it and said it was Mr. Heck Tate. "Well, ask him to come in," said Atticus. "I already did. There's some men outside in the yard, and they want you to come out." At Macomb, grown men stood outside in the front yard for only two reasons: death and politics. I wondered who had died. Jem and I went to the front door, but Atticus called us. "Go back in the house." Jem turned out the living room lights and pressed his nose to his window screen. Aunt Alexandra protested. "Just for a second, Auntie, let's just see who it is," he said. Dill and I took another window. A crowd of men was standing around Atticus. They all seemed to be talking at once. "Moving him to the county jail," Mr. Tate was saying. I don't look for any trouble, but I can't guarantee there won't be any." "Don't be foolish, Heck," said Atticus. "This is Macomb." And I was just uneasy. "Heck, we've got one postponement of this case, just to make sure there's nothing to be uneasy about." "This is Saturday," Atticus said. "Trial'll be Monday. You can keep 'em one night, can't you? I don't think anybody in Macomb won't begrudge me a client with times this hard." There was a murmur of glee that died suddenly with Mr. Dealing said, "Nobody around here's up to anything. It's that old Salem bunch I'm worried about. Can't you get what's that, Heck?" "Change of venue," said Mr. Tate. "Not much point in that now, is it?" Atticus said something inaudible. I turned to Jem, who waved me silence. "Besides," Atticus was saying, "you're not scared of that crowd, are you? Know how they do when they get shinnied up? They don't usually drink on Sunday. They go to church most of the day." Atticus said, "Well, it's a special occasion, though," someone said. They murmured and buzzed until Auntie said if Jem didn't turn on the living room lights, he would disgrace the family. Jem didn't hear. "I don't see why you touched it in the first place," Mr. Linkty was saying. "You've got everything to lose for this, Atticus. I mean everything." "Well, do you really think so?" This was Atticus's dangerous question. "Do you really think you want to move there, Scout? Bam, 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 and the checkerboard was swept clean of my men. Do you really think that, son? Then read this." And Jem would struggle the rest of an evening through the speeches of Henry W. Grady. "Link, that boy might go to the chair, but he's not going till the truth's told." Atticus's voice was even. "And you know what the truth is." Well, there was a murmur among the men, made more ominous when Atticus moved back to the bottom front step, and the men drew near. And suddenly Jem screamed, "Atticus, the phone's ringing!" The men jumped a little and scattered. They were people that we saw every day, merchants and town farmers. Dr. Reynolds was there, but so was Mr. Avery. "Well, answer it, son," Atticus called. Laughter broke them up. When Atticus switched on the overhead light in the living room, he found that Jem was at the window, pale except for a vivid mark of the screen on his nose. "Why on earth are you all sitting in the dark?" he asked. Jem watched him go to his chair and pick up the evening paper. I sometimes think Atticus subjected every crisis of his life to tranquil evaluation behind the Mobile Register, the Birmingham News, and the Montgomery Advertiser. "They were after you, weren't they?" Jem went to him. "They want to get you, don't they?" Atticus lowered the paper and he gazed at Jim. "What have you been reading?" he asked. And then he said gently, "No, son, those were our friends." "It wasn't a gang?" Jim was looking from the corner of his eyes. Atticus tried to stifle a smile, but he didn't make it. "No, we don't have mobs that make nonsense in Macomb. I've never heard of a gang in Macomb." "Ku Klux got after some Catholics one time." "Never heard of any Catholics in Macomb either," Atticus said. "You're confusing that with something else. Way back, about 1920, there was a Klan, but it was a political organization more than anything. Besides, they couldn't find anybody to scare. They paraded by Mr. Sam Levy's house one night, but Sam just stood on his porch and told them that things had come to a pretty pass. He told them, every one of them, the sheets on their back. Sam made them so ashamed of themselves that they went back and went away. The Levy family met all criteria for being fine folks. They did the best they could with the sense they had, and they had been living on the same plot of ground in Macomb for 5 generations." "The Ku Klux gone," said Atticus. "It'll never come back." Well, I walked home with Dill and returned in time to overhear Atticus saying to Annie, "In favor of Southern womanhood as much as anybody, but not for persevering polite fiction at the expense of human life." A pronouncement that made me suspect that they'd been fussing again. I sought Jim and I found him in his room, on the bed, deep in thought. "Have they been at it?" I asked. "Sorta. She won't let him alone about Tom Robinson. She almost said Atticus was disgracing the family." "Scout, I'm scared." "Well, scared of what?" "Scared about Atticus. Somebody might hurt him." Jim preferred to remain mysterious. All he would say to my question was to go on and leave him alone. Next day was Sunday. In the interval between Sunday school and church, when the congregation stretched its legs, I saw Atticus standing in the yard with another knot of men. Mr. Hectate was present, and I wondered if he had seen the light. He never went to church. Even Mr. Underwood was there. Mr. Underwood had no use for any organization but the Macomb Tribune, of which he was the sole owner, editor, and printer. His days were spent at his linotype, where he refreshed himself occasionally from an ever-present gallon jug of cherry wine. He rarely gathered news. People brought it to him. It was said that he made up every edition of the Macomb Tribune out of his own head and wrote it down on the linotype. This was unbelievable. Something must have been up to haul Mr. Underwood out. I caught Atticus coming in the door. He said that they'd moved Tom Robinson to the Macomb jail. He also said, more to himself than me, that if they'd kept him there in the first place, there wouldn't have been any fuss. I watched him take his seat on the 3rd row from the front, and I heard him rumble, "Nearer, my God, to thee," some notes behind the rest of us. He never sat with Auntie Jim and me. He liked to be by himself in church. The fake peace was prevailed on Sundays was made more irritating by Aunt Alexandra's presence. Atticus would flee to his office directly after dinner, where we sometimes looked in on him, and we could find him sitting back in his swivel chair reading. Aunt Alexandra composed herself for a 2-hour nap and dared us to make any noise in the yard. The neighborhood was reticent. Jem, in his old age, has taken to his room with a stack of football magazines. So Dill and I spent our Sundays creeping around in Deer's pasture. Shooting on Sundays was prohibited, so Dill and I kicked Jem's football around the pasture for a while, which was no fun. Dill asked if I'd like to have a poke at Boo Radley. I said I didn't think it'd be nice to bother him, and spent the rest of the afternoon filling Dill in on last winter's events. He was considerably impressed. We parted at supper, and after our meal, Jem and I were settling down to a routine evening when Atticus did something that interested us. He came in the living room carrying a long extension cord, and there was a light bulb on the end. "I'm going out for a while," he said. "You folks will be in bed when I come back, so I'll say good night now." And with that, he put on his hat and went out the back door. "He's taking the car," said Jem. Our father had a few peculiarities. One was he never ate desserts. Another one was that he liked to walk. As far as back as I can remember, there was always a Chevrolet in excellent condition in the car house, and Atticus put many miles on it on business trips, but in Macomb he walked to and from his office 4 times a day, covering about 2 miles. He said it was his only exercise, the walking, and in Macomb, if one went for a walk with no definite purpose in mind, it was correct to believe one's mind incapable of definite purpose. Later on, I bade my aunt and brother good night and was well into a book when I heard Jim rattling around in his room. His go-to bed noises were so familiar to me that I knocked on the door. "Why ain't you going to bed?" "I'm going downtown for a while." He was changing pants. "Why? It's almost 10 o'clock, Jim." He knew it, but he was going anyway. "Then I'm going with you. If you say no, you're not. I'm going anyway. Here?" Jim saw that he would have to fight me to keep me home, and I suppose he thought a fight would antagonize Auntie, so he gave in with little grace. I dressed quickly. We waited until Auntie's light went out, and we walked quietly down the back steps. There was no moon tonight. "Dill'll want to come," I whispered. "So he will," Jim said gloomily. We leaped over the driveway wall, cut through Miss Rachel's side yard, and went to Dill's window. Jim whistled Bob White. Dill's face appeared at the screen, disappeared, and 5 minutes later he unhooked the screen and crawled out. An old campaigner, he did not speak till we were on the sidewalk. "What's up?" Jim got the looks around, an affliction Calpurnia said all boys caught at his age. "Just got this feeling," Jim said, just this feeling. We went by Mrs. Du Bois's house, standing empty and shuttered, her camellias grown up in weeds and Johnson grass. There were 8 more houses at the post office corner. The south side of the square was deserted. Giant monkey buzz of bushes bristled on each corner, and between them an iron hitch and rail glistened under the lights. A light shone on the county toilet, otherwise that side of the courthouse was dark. A large square of stores surrounded the courthouse square, and dim lights burned from deep within. Atticus's office was in the courthouse when he began his practice, but after several years of it, he moved to the quieter quarters in the Macomb Bank building. When we rounded the corner of the square, we saw the car parked in front of the bank. "He's in there," said Jim. He wasn't. His office was reached by a long hallway. Looking down the hall, we should have seen Atticus Finch, attorney at law, in small silver letters against the light behind the door. It was dark. Jim peered at the bank door to make sure. He turned the knob. The door was locked. "Let's go up the street. Maybe he's visiting Mr. Underwood." Mr. Underwood not only ran Macomb Tribune office, but he lived in it. And that's it, above it. He covered the courthouse and the jailhouse news simply by looking out his upstairs window. The office building was on the northwest corner of the square, and to reach it we had to pass the jail. The Macomb jail was the most venerable, hideous of the county's building. Atticus said it was like something Cousin Joshua Sinclair might have designed. It's certainly somebody's dream. Starkly out of place in a town of square-faced stones and steep-roofed houses, the Macomb jail was a miniature Gothic joke, 1 cell wide, 2 cells high, complete with tiny battlements and a flying buttress. Its fantasy was heightened by its red brick facade and the thick steel bars at its ecclesiastic windows. It stood on no lonely hill, but was wedged between Tyndall's hardware store and Macomb Tribune office. The jail was Macomb's only conversation piece. Its detractors said it looked like a Victorian privy, and its supporters said it gave the town a good, solid, respectable look. No stranger would ever suspect that it was full of Negroes. As we walked up the sidewalk, we saw a solitary light burning in the distance. "That's funny," said Jim. "Jails doesn't have an outside light." "Looks like it's over the door," said Jill. A long extension cord ran between the bars of a second-floor window and down the side of the building, and in the light from its bare bulb, Atticus was sitting propped against the front door. He was sitting in one of his office chairs. He was reading, oblivious of the night bugs dancing over his head. I made to run, but Jim caught me. Don't go to him, he said. He might not like it. He's all right. Let's go home. I just wanted to see where he was. Well, we were taking a shortcut across the square when 4 dusty cars came in from the Meridian Highway, moving slowly in a line. They went around the square, past the bank building, and they stopped in front of the jail. Nobody got out. We saw Atticus look up from his newspaper. He closed it, folded it deliberately, he dropped it in his lap, and pushed his hat to the back of his head. He seemed to be expecting them. Come on, Jim whispered. We streaked across the square, across the street, until we were in the shelter of a jittery jungle door. Jim peeked up the sidewalk. We can get closer, he said, and we ran to Tyndall's hardware door, near enough at the same time to scream. In ones and twos, men got out of the cars. Shadows became substances, and light revealed solid shapes moving toward the jail door. Atticus remained where he was, and the men hid from his view. Is he in there, Mr. Finch? A man said. He is, we heard Atticus answer, and he's asleep, but don't wake him up. In obedience to my father, there followed what I later realized was the sickeningly comical aspect of an unfunny situation, because the men talked in near whispers. You know what we want, another man said. Get us out of the door, Mr. Finch. You can turn around and go home, Walter, Atticus said pleasantly. Heck, Tate's around somewhere. The hell he is, said another man. Heck's bunch is so deep in the wood they won't get out till morning. Indeed. And why so? Called them off on a snipe hunt, was the succinct answer. Didn't you think of that, Mr. Finch? I thought about it, but I didn't believe it. Well then, my father's voice was still the same. That changes things, doesn't it? It do, another deep voice said. Its owner was a shadow. Do you really think so? Well, this was the second time I heard Atticus ask that question in 2 days, and admit somebody's man would get jumped. But this was too good to miss, so I broke away from Jim, and I ran as fast as I could to Atticus. Jim shrieked and tried to catch me, but I had a lead on him, and I pushed my way through dark, smelly bodies and burst into the circle of light. Hey, Atticus! I thought he'd have a fine surprise, but his face killed my joy. A flash of plain fear was going out of his eyes, but returned when Dill and Jim wriggled into the light. There was a smell of stale whiskey and pig pen about them, and when I glanced around, I discovered that these men were strangers. They were not the people I saw last night. A hot embarrassment shot through me. I'd leaped triumphantly into a ring of people I had never seen before. Atticus got up from his chair, but he was moving slowly, like an old man. He put the newspaper down very carefully, adjusting its creases with lingering fingers. They were trembling a little. Go home, Jim, he said, and take Scout and Dill home. Well, we were accustomed to prompt, if not always cheerful acquiescence to Atticus's instructions, but from the way he stood, Jim was not thinking of budging. Go home, I said. Jim shook his head. As Atticus's fist went to his hips, so did Jim's, and as they faced each other, I could see literal resemblance between them. Jim's soft brown eyes and hair, his oval face and snug-fitting ears were our mother's, contrasting oddly with Atticus's gray and black hair and square-foot features. But they were somehow alike. Mutual defiance made them alike. Son, I said go home. Jim shook his head. I'll send him home, a burly man said, and he grabbed Jim roughly by the collar. He yanked Jim nearly off his feet. Don't you touch him! I kicked the man swiftly. Barefooted, I was surprised to see him fall back in real pain. I intended to kick his shin, but I aimed too high. That'll do, Scout. Atticus put his hands on his shoulders. Don't kick folks, no, he said, as I was pleading justification. Ain't nobody gonna do Jim that way, I said. All right, Mr. Finch, you get him out of here, somebody growled. You got 15 seconds to get him out of here. In the midst of this strange assembly, Atticus stood trying to make Jim mind him. I ain't going, was his steady answer to Atticus's threats and requests, and finally, please, Jim, take him home. I was getting a bit tired of that, but I felt Jem had his own reasons for doing as he did, in view of his prospects, once Atticus did get him home. I looked around the crowd. It was a summer's night, but the men were dressed, well, most of them, in overalls and denim shirts buttoned up to the collars. I thought they must be cold-natured, as their sleeves were unrolled and buttoned at the cuffs, and some wore hats pulled down firmly over their ears. They were sullen-looking, sleepy-eyed men who seemed unused to late hours. I sought once more for a familiar face, and at the center of the semicircle, I found one. "Hey, Mr. Cunningham!" The man did not hear me, it seemed. "Hey, Mr. Cunningham, how's your entailments getting along?" Mr. Walter Cunningham's legal affairs were well known to me. Atticus had once described them at length. The big man blinked and hooked his thumbs in his overall straps. He seemed uncomfortable. He cleared his throat and he looked away. My friendly overture had fallen flat. Mr. Cunningham wore no hat, and the top of his half of his forehead was white in contrast to his sun-scorched face, which led me to believe that he had worn one most days. He shifted his feet, clad in heavy work shoes. "Well, don't you remember me, Mr. Cunningham? I'm Jean Louise Finch. You brought us some hickory nuts one time, remember?" I began to sense the futility one feels when unacknowledged by a chance acquaintance. I go to school with Walter," I began again. "He's your boy, ain't he?" "Ain't he, sir?" Mr. Cunningham was moved to a faint nod. He did know me, after all. "He's in my grade," I said, "and he does right well. He's a good boy," I added, "real nice boy. We brought him home for dinner one time. Maybe he told you about it. I beat him up one time, but he was real nice about it. Tell him hey for me, won't you?" Atticus had said he was polite. Hold on one second. Atticus said that he was polite. It was polite things to talk to people about what they were interested in, not about what you were interested in. And Mr. Cunningham displayed no interest in his son, so I tackled his entailments once more, in a last-ditch effort to make him, feel at home. "Entailments are bad," I was advising him, when I slowly awoke to the fact that I was addressing the entire aggregation. The men were all looking at me. Some had their mouths half open. Atticus had stopped poking at Jem. They were just standing together beside Dill. Their attention amounted to fascination. Atticus's mouth, even, was half open, an attitude that he once described as uncouth. Our eyes met and he shut it. "Well, Atticus, I was just saying to Mr. Cunningham that entailments are bad and all that, but you said not to worry. It just takes a long time sometimes, that you'd all write it out together." I was slowly drying up, wondering what idiocy I was committing. Entailments seemed all right enough for a living room talk. I began to feel sweat gathering at the edges of my hair. I could stand anything but a bunch of people looking at me. They were quite still. "What's the matter?" Atticus said nothing. I looked around and up at Mr. Cunningham, whose face was equally impassive. And then he did a peculiar thing. He squatted down and he took me by both my shoulders. "I'll tell him you said, 'Hey, little lady,'" he said. And then he straightened up and he waved a big paw. "Let's clear out," he said. "Let's get going, boys." As they had come, in ones and twos, the men shuffled back to their ramshackle cars. Doors slammed, engines coughed, and they were gone. I turned to Atticus, but Atticus had gone to the jail and was leaning against it with his face to the wall. I went to him and I pulled his sleeve. "Can we go home now?" He nodded, produced his handkerchief, gave his face a going over, and blew his nose violently. "Miss Finch?" Soft, husky voice came from the darkness above. "They gone?" Atticus stepped back and looked up. "They've gone," he said. "Get some sleep, Tom. They won't bother you any more." From a different direction, another voice cut crisply through the night. "You're damn tootin' they won't. Had you covered all the time, Atticus." Mr. Underwood had a double-barreled shotgun, and he was leaning out his window above the Macomb Tribune office. Well, it was long past my bedtime, and I was growing quite tired. It seemed that Atticus and Mr. Underwood would talk for the rest of the night, Mr. Underwood out the window and Atticus up at him. Finally, Atticus returned, switched off the light above the jail door, and picked up his chair. "Can I carry it for you, Mr. Finch?" asked Dill. He had not said a word the whole time. "Why, thank you, son." Walking toward the office, Dill and I fell into step behind Atticus and Jim. Dill was encumbered by the chair, and his pace was slow. Atticus and Jim were well ahead of us, and I assumed that Atticus was giving him hell for not going home. But I was wrong. And as they passed under a streetlight, Atticus reached out and massaged Jim's hair, his one gesture of affection. And that, my friends, is the end of 15. So much happens. I want to remind you that Scout says a number of times in the book how Dill just talks and talks and talks and talks, and he can't stop talking and he can't stop making up things. But this is the one time he says nothing. The men come to the house, and it's one set of men. It's like professional men, okay? Men who work in the town. Men who are not meaning to cause any trouble or any violence. But they do warn Atticus, and they are warning Atticus of these men that we see at the end of the chapter. Atticus does something out of character. He leaves the house at night, late at night, which is like, after dinner, bedtime, and the kids aren't used to that. Jim goes after him. Scout and Dill come along. I think that Jem and Dill got the intensity of everything that was happening without having to be told. I think that they knew it was trouble. That fact that their dad was there at the jail. He was guarding Tom Robinson, and he was going to stay there as long as it took, until morning. But once these men came and they showed up, then there was trouble. Scout seemed to be the only one who didn't realize that there was trouble. And the men said that they sent the sheriff and some others off on a hunt, a fake hunt. They made up something that they had to go off and look for, care about, like a false report, if you will. And it seems that Scout's the only one who didn't get what was going on. Remember that she is the youngest one, so that makes sense. And she bursts in to be surprising, and she realizes she's in a group of men that she does not know, except for one, Mr. Cunningham. And she smiles and she tries to be nice. She's been learning how to make small talk. She does have Auntie living with her now. And so we had that one chapter where it talks a long time about Auntie and how she is and how she addresses people and having meetings and having all these socials. And Scout has been learning. And so she tries to talk. She tries to bring up two subjects that she thinks he will talk about: his son and his business issues, his business just in general. What she does is she makes a human contact by talking about his son, about talking about how she knows his son, and how his son has been to her house to eat. And she talks about what Atticus had said about entailments and that it just takes time and we're all in it together. I think that she accidentally shamed him because those men had come there to cause problems, to get Tom Robinson, probably pull him out and probably kill him. And if they had to hurt Atticus along the way to get to it, that's what they were going to do. And she ended up unwittingly stopping it by putting a real face on some of the violence that they were thinking about doing. It's a really big turning point in the chapter. She doesn't fully get what is going on, but she will as it goes on. Remember that we start this book and she says she and Jim were talking about what led to him breaking his arm. We're about at the age when he breaks his arm. So we are more than halfway through this book. This is what's left. Just this. We're going to find out how he broke his arm. And what was it? Was it Boo Radley? Or was it the Yules? We're going to get to know a lot more about all of that. Now, don't forget to take the quiz, and we have one more chapter for this week, and that is chapter 16. And I hope that you are enjoying the story. You're either listening to me or listening to it on YouTube or reading it yourself. Either way, just make sure you're taking it all in. And I will see you next time.